In this chapter we're going to learn about the blurring and sharpening filters here inside of Photoshop Elements, two filters that do two completely opposite tasks. So the blurring filters will take an image and move it further out of focus, and the sharpening filters will attempt to add more clarity to the file, thus moving it into tighter focus. And although it doesn't literally do such a thing, it is able to trick the eye into thinking that's what's happening. So in this video we'll be focusing on blurring, if that makes sense, and how and why we do such a thing. So open up the London Zoo themed image found in the project files, and as you can see over here in the layers panel, we're working with a fully layered version of this file. Now we've already discussed the limitations of filters, and one of them is that we can only apply a filter to one layer at a time. That means we're not going to be able to work with this whole composition. Instead, we're going to need to find the layer that needs blurring and work with that. And then if any other layer requires the same effect, then we're just going to have to apply it to it in a separate pass. And as it turns out, our objective in this video will be to blur this dirty, muddy background so that the viewer can focus on the areas that matter inside the image file. And hopefully the mud will become an important but inconspicuous part of the image. That is our objective anyway. So in order to do that, we're going to need to turn the visibility of all of these supporting layers off and leave just the main background layer on. And we can do that easily and quickly by just dragging over all of these eyeballs in one go. Now make sure that the layer is active, and we're going to duplicate the layer by right clicking on it and then choosing the duplicate layer command like so, and I'll give it a name of LB for lens blur so we know what it is, and we're set to go. Now let me just quickly explain why we've just done that when we could have applied the filter straight onto the original layer. Well, if we apply it onto the original, then we make those changes permanent. And if we wanted to come back in here later on and blur a different area or anything like that, then we just can't do it. At least with the layer duplicated, we have something to go back on, so we can chuck away the layer that we're working on, the duplicated version, and restore the original anytime we want and not have too many consequences from it. So let's take a look at the blurring filters. To do that, we can either switch out to the effects panel and work from there like we saw in the previous chapter, or we can just work direct from the menu at the top here, and I'm going to settle for the latter of those two options. So come up to the filter menu and then come down to the blur submenu, which will show us all of our available filters that blur the layer that we have active. Now all of these filters blur the layer in different ways. So it's another one of those opportunities to get in there and experiment. However, what I will do quickly is summarize and then tell you the blurring filters which you're going to be using probably 95% of the time. So average, first of all, is the one filter in here I wouldn't call a true blur. Instead, it fills the layer with what it deems to be the average color value of the entire image file. If you were with me in an earlier video when we were looking at removing a color cast, then you will have seen a really good use for it. Blur and Blur More are single shot blurs that have no dialog boxes and no options. Instead, they simply apply one fairly light pass of blurring to the entire layer. They are filters that are pretty much redundant these days, and I have to be honest, I don't think I've ever used either of those filters for any projects I'm working on. It's a completely different story with the next 6 filters, and they are just different ways of blurring your image. They all present you with their own controls and options, and they all work at taking the pixels in the layer out of focus. Only the first two here, Gaussian blur and lens blur, are going to be really useful on a day-to-day basis. My advice is this: if you're trying to recreate the type of blur you get through the lens of a camera, then lens blur is going to be the one you're after. For everything else, use Gaussian blur. Now's probably a good time to answer a question I hear a lot, and that's why would we ever want to take a photo out of focus? Can understand trying to add more clarity to it, but why would we want to take it out of focus even more than it is already? Well, there's two main purposes for it. Firstly, to create a depth of field effect where we have the subject in focus, such as the lion and the gorilla in this image, and where we have details that are not important to the overall image, we can take them out of focus, which is, as I mentioned, what we'll be doing with the dirt above the animals and the wooden beams below them. The other reason that we might want to blur is to hide minor flaws or imperfections. So we could blur parts of someone's face in order to hide wrinkles or aging skin, or maybe even freckles or face stubbles, anything like that. We could add a blur to the whole image and then mask away areas outside of the face that we don't want blurred. And inside the face region also. So things like the lips, nose and eyes, we wouldn't want to apply any blur to whatsoever because they're going to be a primary focus inside of a portrait shot, and we would be able to mask them away so we're not affecting them with the blur filter. Okay, so let's give it a test drive. Go ahead and click the lens blur option to open it up, and you'll see that we get a large, complicated looking dialog box where we can adjust various settings and affect the way the blur interacts with the image. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these settings, but I do want to cover the important ones that you'll need to understand to get the filter working properly. Firstly, let's make sure we have the preview option turned on so we can see all of our modifications as we make them. Then I'd suggest we turn on more accurate so we get the most detailed, accurate effects possible. The depth map section is good if you're working with a mask or selection outline and you want to apply it directly to the blur effect. All we need to do is to save a selection out that represents the area of the image we want to blur, and then we would have access to it inside this drop down menu. So for example, I have already created a mask of the area I want to blur, so I could just click the drop down and then choose the blur mask like so. And now if we have invert checked, you can see that the mask is protecting the lion and allowing the rest of the image to be blurred using this filter. We are going to be using this mask because it definitely does the job we want it to. However, instead of applying it here, which will apply it to the layer once we click OK and give us no ability thereafter to ever go back and change things, I'm going to apply it as a standard layer mask instead. And once we've applied the filter, you'll see exactly how I'm going to do that. So for now, I'll switch the source back to none, and we're back where we were. The next section is entitled Iris, and if you're familiar with how a DSLR works, then all that's going on here is the settings associated with the iris of the camera. So the shape signifies the shape of the iris in your camera. There's not really a one-size-fits-all solution, so have a play around and see what looks best for you. I'm going to stick with hexagon though. Radius controls the amount of blurring we're adding to the image. Blade curvature changes the curvature of the blades that make up the iris. And rotation lets us simulate rotating the iris in the lens element. Those last two options are quite techy, so if you're not familiar with them, either leave them to their default settings or have a play around and see what you can come up with. I'm going to leave mine set to 0. The radius option, however, is extremely important because it controls the amount of blurring we get inside of our image. Now, when we've applied this blur to our layer, we will, as already mentioned, be masking the lion away so he doesn't receive any of the blur treatment. We want him nicely in focus, so when we're setting this radius value, we need to just do it with the background and some elements of the foreground in mind. So I'm going to experiment by moving the slider around, but ultimately I think that a value of 12 is roughly what we want, so I'll leave things set to that. Specular highlights lets us control the brightness of white highlights once the blurring is applied, and take the sting out of them by just dropping them off a touch. That's usually going to come into play if we're adding quite a harsh blurring effect, which we're not in this example. Finally, we have this noise option that lets us simulate noise inside the blur, which we can add by just increasing this slider. We can choose a uniform or Gaussian distribution of noise, and we can also make it black and white by checking the monochromatic checkbox down here at the bottom of the control panel. I'll drop that back down to 0 because I don't want to add any noise to this image whatsoever. When we're happy with all the settings, which I am, I'll click OK to accept them and commit them to the layer. Now, we've got a couple of problems so far. The first one is that if you remember back to the healing brush tutorial, we healed away some of the grass in the background, and if I go ahead and turn that layer back on now, we see it really stands out due to us not having blurred the layer as well. So we've only blurred the background layer and not the layer that has our healing on it. The other issue is that we've also got this gorilla healing down here also that makes it a little trickier as well. The other issue is that we've got to apply our mask to the lion and make sure he's completely in focus. And I'm also going to talk you briefly through how I created the mask, so you've got it there for your information, because it was a little more difficult than a basic mask would be. So you'll be able to go ahead and create it if you want to do that yourself as well. You'll be pleased to know that we're going to tackle all of those issues and problems inside the next video, so I'll see you there.